building was old, much older than its tenants, its cracked facade a relic of a time long gone. It stood on a forgotten corner of the city, towering over the streets like a ghost from a bygone era. Dim streetlights flickered, casting long shadows that seemed to crawl along the pavement. It wasn't a place people came to by choice, more of a last resort. Rent was cheap, and for Simon, that was enough. He had been living in apartment 3C for the better part of a year. Alone. It suited him quiet, no one bothered him. Or so he thought. The building's interior was as decrepit as its exterior, with worn, creaky wooden floors and walls covered in peeling wallpaper that gave off a damp, musty smell. The dim lighting in the hallway barely illuminated the corridors, making the place feel like a tomb. At night, the flickering bulbs created an unsettling strobe effect, and the silence was broken only by the occasional drip from a leaky pipe or the distant hum of old radiators groaning under the strain of age. But lately, it wasn't just the usual sounds that kept Simon awake. It started a few weeks ago. The first night was innocuous enough. He heard a shuffle in the hallway, a soft murmur, the sound of footsteps. He assumed it was one of his neighbors coming home late. He went back to his book, the sound of pages turning louder than anything else in the room. The noise stopped. But that night, as he lay in bed, there was something different, a feeling he couldn't quite shake. Something just outside his door. The following night, it happened again. The noise in the hall, soft footsteps, a whisper, a door creaking. It could have been anyone, he reasoned. But curiosity gnawed at him. He got up, padding softly to the door, his bare feet cool against the creaky wood floor. He pressed his eye to the peephole. The distorted fisheye view of the hall beyond swam before him. At first, nothing. Just the dim light, the door opposite his own, 3D, and the empty corridor stretching in either direction. He felt a bit foolish and turned to go back to bed, but then something caught his eye. A figure further down the hallway near the door to 3A. They were standing still, their back turned toward him. It was Mrs. Harding, the elderly woman who lived in the building for years, her hunched frame instantly recognizable, even in the dim light. Simon watched, confused. She was facing her door but not moving, not going in, just standing. "Mrs. Harding," he whispered, though she couldn't hear him through the door. Suddenly, her body jerked unnaturally, and a chilling sound filled the air, a wet, choking noise. Simon's heart raced as he saw her head snap back, her mouth open in a silent scream. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. Dark shadows slithered around her body, their movements too fast and erratic to follow, like tendrils of smoke coiling and tightening. He reached for the doorknob, his hand trembling. He was about to fling it open when everything stopped. The hallway was empty. Mrs. Harding was gone. He yanked open the door, stepping into the hallway. The air was cold, colder than usual. He rushed to 3A and knocked, his fist pounding against the old wood. No response. He knocked again, louder this time. The door swung open, and there stood Mrs. Harding, alive and well, though she looked at him with surprise and a little irritation. "Simon, what is it, dear? You look pale." I thought I saw. Are you okay?" She frowned. "I'm fine, dear. Maybe you should go lie down, You look like you've seen a ghost." She chuckled softly, a sound that didn't seem to belong to her, and gently shut the door. Simon stood there, dumbfounded. He couldn't shake the image of her in the hallway, that grotesque, twisting figure. It felt too real to be a hallucination. He went back to his apartment, locking the door behind him, his pulse still racing. The next morning, the building was buzzing with whispers. Mrs. Harding had been found dead in her apartment, her body contorted in a way that defied explanation, as if something had crushed her from the inside. Simon felt a chill run down his spine. He hadn't imagined it. He had seen something terrible happen to her, something unnatural, and then she was gone. The days passed, but the feeling of unease lingered. Every night now, Simon heard noises in the hallway. Sometimes it was a shuffling, other times a soft whispering that seemed just out of earshot, a constant murmur that made his skin crawl. He tried to ignore it, tried to convince himself it was just the old building settling or other tenants moving about. But every time, curiosity won. Every time he found himself at the door, looking through the peephole. One night, it was Mr. Hobbs, the man in 3 billions, a middle-aged recluse who rarely left his apartment. Simon watched as Mr. Hobbs stood motionless in front of his own door, his head hanging at an unnatural angle. His hands were twisted, fingers bent at odd angles, and then, without warning, he began to claw at his own face, tearing at his flesh with a frantic, unnatural force. Simon's stomach lurched and he pulled away from the door, horrified. When he gathered the courage to open it and check, Mr. Hobbs was gone. The hallway was silent. The next day, Simon heard the news. Mr. Hobbs had been found dead in his apartment. The cause of death? Suicide, they said. But Simon knew better. He had seen the truth. It became a grim routine. Night after night, the noises would return. Simon would look through the peephole and witness something horrifying, a neighbor contorting, writhing, being consumed by shadows, or doing something grotesque and self-destructive. And then, the next day, they were dead. No one else in the building seemed to notice. No one else saw what Simon saw. He tried to ignore it, tried to leave the building a few times to get away from whatever malevolent force was at work here, but something always pulled him back. The building wouldn't let him go. It was as if it had become a part of him, and he a part of it. Weeks passed, and soon there were fewer neighbors left. One by one, they all fell victim to the terrifying things Simon saw through the peephole. He stopped trying to warn them. It was no use. They never believed him, and they always ended up dead anyway. It was as if their fates were sealed the moment he saw them through the peephole. The noises in the hallway grew louder, more insistent. Sometimes it sounded like scratching at his door, other times like muffled voices, too low to understand but filled with an unmistakable malice. The shadows seemed to grow thicker, darker, creeping into his apartment through the cracks under the door, invading his dreams. One night, after hours of restless tossing and turning, Simon awoke to the sound of heavy breathing just outside his door. It wasn't a shuffle or murmur this time. It was something else, something waiting, his heart pounding. Simon crept to the door and pressed his eye to the peephole once more. But this time, the hall was empty. No figures, no shadows, just the suffocating silence. He stared for a moment longer, his breath caught in his throat, and then his reflection blinked. Simon stumbled back, his mind reeling. What he saw wasn't possible, but there it was. He had seen himself, standing in the hallway, staring back through the peephole. But it wasn't quite him. The figure's eyes were sunken, hollow, and his skin was pale, almost translucent. And then, just as before, the figure began to twist and convulse, its body racked with violent spasms. Dark tendrils emerged from the walls, wrapping around his distorted form, pulling him into the shadows. Simon screamed, falling back onto the floor, scrambling away from the door as if it might burst open, and the thing he had seen might come for him. It was him. He knew it. The thing he had seen through the peephole. It was his turn. Trembling, Simon got up and threw the deadbolt on the door, but he knew it wouldn't make a difference. The building wanted him. Whatever had taken his neighbors was coming for him next. He spent the rest of the night pacing his apartment, every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind making him flinch. His mind raced. Could he leave? Could he escape? But deep down, Simon knew the truth. There was no escape. The building had claimed him just as it had claimed the others. As dawn broke, Simon sat in his living room, staring at the door. He felt the darkness closing in, suffocating him. The shadows in the room seemed to pulse, growing closer with every passing moment. The building was alive, and it was hungry. And then, the door creaked open. Simon didn't need to look through the peephole this time. He knew what waited for him on the other side. The last thing he saw as the shadows engulfed him was his own reflection, twisted and contorted, staring back with empty eyes. The building remained silent. And then, once more, the noises began in the hallway.